Right, so we're here to try and just sort of like have a look at what's happened over the last 4 weeks with regards to the Nicola Bulley case, and to really try and get an understanding from a comms perspective. What went right, what went wrong. Lancashire Police came under significant fire primarily because they released a statement which reveals quite sensitive information about Nicola herself. Looking at the notes of what they said that she has struggles with alcohol and perimenopause, and they class her as a high-risk missing person with specific vulnerabilities. Penny Mordaunt, who's the leader of the House of Commons, came out and denounced it as actually shocking, sexist, misogynistic. Yvette Cooper, Shadow Home Secretary, has been equally scathing in the comments that she's made as well. But the family themselves actually issued a statement shortly after the police issued that statement. And they said that although we know that Nikki would not have wanted this, there are people out there speculating and threatening to sell stories about her. This is appalling and needs to stop. So what do we think has happened here? Have the family given authority to the police to make the statement, or was the statement issued by the police independently, and were they right to have issued it in the first place? What do you think?
I think that when this information was released, it was 3 weeks into the investigation. So it's highly unusual to release such sensitive information per se, but after 3 weeks, very unusual, because how can it possibly help the investigation? So clearly something else was at play. And when they held the live press conference, they only talked about Nicola having specific vulnerabilities. The press obviously questioned what those were, and they refused to be drawn on that. But that was, I think, on the morning. By 6 p.m, they'd issued a further statement saying that she had struggles with alcohol as a result of menopause/perimenopause, which again was really unusual. So were they pushed into it or not? Had they made a mistake in mentioning it at all in the earlier press conference? Or were people trying to sell stories?
When they issued a statement about the vulnerabilities and didn't shed any further detail on that, was that their mistake? Because if you're going to mention something, you can't just leave it dangling there. You've got to explain what you mean.
I think it's incredibly naive. I mean, any news desk in the country would be phoning the reporter who attended that press conference, and it was a live press conference, and they said she had vulnerabilities, and saying, well, what are these? Go and find out. And that, of course, will lead to more door knocking. So all of a sudden, 3 weeks in, we're getting all this new information on a case where we'd assume this was completely normal, but she'd mysteriously gone missing, which is why the story was so massive. But all of a sudden, there's somebody who's vulnerable. Now, I've worked on missing persons cases, and almost always they'll announce straight away this is a vulnerable person who's gone missing, and that will to some extent that will then control the narrative of how the press report it. But this didn't happen here, and I think that was a major failing on behalf of the police. They're going to do it early, or don't do it at all.
So why do you think they delayed it?
I think the press conference at which vulnerabilities was announced played out as being very defensive on the part of the police. It was headlines in every single national newspaper and every TV bulletin and every talk show every single day. It was massive. So I think they felt they had to say something. I think they said the wrong thing. I mean, in a situation like this, when you're talking about press handling, they will have their own press office and they will be in direct contact with the media. Back in the day, press offices would be briefing journalists behind the scenes with information like this, saying, actually, this is the case. She is a vulnerable individual, so we think it's an accident. But that doesn't happen anymore post-Leveson. There's a lack of trust between the police and the press, and of course, perfect storm, because there's a massive lack of trust in the police from the public. And this all played a huge part, I would say, in this case.
If you were advising the comms team of Lancashire Police at the time, what would you advise them to have done?
If they seriously believe that these vulnerabilities played a part in her going missing, I think they should have been briefing some of these senior crime reporters behind the scenes early on. So I think that there was early mishandling, and then, the horse has bolted. So this press conference, 3 weeks in, was an attempt to dismiss some of the wild theories, but it just caused more speculation. And I think they also used different personnel at each of the 2 or 3 press conferences. So
Which
again,
kind of
that
dilutes it somewhat,
doesn't
doesn't it?
play well.
Yeah, and at a time of crisis, you need consistency,
Yes.
you need stability, you need that assurance from whoever it is who's delivering that message, don't you?
And I think they brought out the detective superintendent in charge at the press conference we referenced earlier, 3 weeks into the investigation. So possibly she should have been seen publicly earlier on. Consistency of messaging.
And it seems like they probably became aware of that, which is why she came out at the point she did.
I think so.
Yeah. Do you think the media were at fault with any of the way in which they covered this story and reported on it over the last 4 weeks?
Well, let's separate the mainstream media from social media, because one of the massive problems in this case, and possibly unique, was the huge amount of social media interest. And amateur sleuths on social media were coming down to this location, this tiny village in Lancashire, and doing horrific things like going in people's back gardens with torches and so breaking into what they saw as derelict buildings.
And you had one TikTok video that got over 1 million views.
Just shocking.
Yeah, crazy.
So when the family talked about being vilified, I think a lot of that vilification was on social media. The police lost control of the narrative. There was a void, and that was being filled by wild theories from social media.
How do you view the family courting the media directly themselves? Do you think that was born out of frustration? Do you think that it was an advised thing to do? Was it the right thing for them to have done?
I wouldn't have thought the police would have advised them to do it, but it suggests that the people in the police communications team were possibly not very experienced, because of the family should really have their family liaison officers, of course, which they have referenced in their statement and thanked, but family liaison officers don't deal with the press, they deal with the family. So it suggests that the press team possibly were not as strong as they should have been, or advised the family. So I believe it was born out of frustration. They believed that she was still out there and they wanted to find her.
So in general, just to sum up then, so we're looking at the police and saying, well, actually there was inconsistency of the messaging, the delivery of that message, the content contained within that messaging as well. There's, I guess there's a kind of like a suspicion in terms of how privy were they to certain elements of information and their decision-making process and when to actually use that information. It seems like they've made the wrong call, potentially.
I think they lost control of the narrative very, very early on. They weren't treating it as a criminal investigation, but what they hadn't foreseen is the level of interest. So they probably should have taken some advice from outside forces, some help from PR experts. I mean, a lot of people who work in police press offices are quite junior. And sometimes the people in charge of them are on the operational side and are not people who have PR expertise. And sometimes that can go wrong. And so, sometimes they can handle it very well. I mean, there was a case, the Salisbury poisonings, apparently Wiltshire Police Press Office handled it absolutely brilliantly. They were giving regular updates to the press. The press were very complimentary about the way they handled it. So I'm not giving a blanket criticism of police, but there certainly is an element that things have changed since the Leveson inquiry, and the police don't brief media behind the scenes because they're frightened to, or the trust has gone. And I can see that this has come about partly as a result of that.
And if you're the one in charge with the responsibility of controlling the message, it's always important, isn't it, to make sure that you consider every single permutation and every single criticism come back on whatever it is you're saying, but also consider what other information is there that you're not aware of, and you need to make sure you've got as much as you can to hand, because then you're better armed, a better place, and then you can get the right messaging out there. Wonderful. Thank you.